On my birthday, my parents gave my brother a new car and me a lecture. Even the birthday cake had his name on it. I laughed along so I wouldn't cry. That night, I grabbed a hoodie, $60, and disappeared. 2 weeks later, my dad called in tears. Please, just come home. There were 18 candles pushed into a sheet cake that afternoon, and not one of them was for me. I want to start there, because that's the detail I keep coming back to when I try to explain this to people who ask why I left the way I did in the middle of the night, with nothing but a hoodie and a shoebox full of birthday cash. They expect a bigger reason. A fight. A slammed door. Something with volume. What they get instead is a cake. White frosting, blue piping, and the word congratulations looping across the top in a hand I recognized from the bakery 3 towns over. The one my mother always used for special occasions. The occasion was not my birthday. The occasion, as far as the cake was concerned, was my brother turning 16 in 3 months. I stood in the kitchen doorway holding a stack of paper plates I'd been sent to fetch from the pantry, and I watched my mother set that cake down in the center of the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. My father was already outside. I could hear him through the screen door, laughing at something, his voice carrying the particular warmth he reserved for moments he considered important. I put the plates down and went to see what was so important. In the driveway sat a truck. Not new exactly, but new enough. A few years old, silver, with a bow zip-tied to the grill. A blue tarp lay crumpled on the grass beside it, already forgotten. The way wrapping paper gets forgotten the second the gift underneath is real. My brother stood in front of it in his socks, mouth open, not saying anything yet because he hadn't caught up to what he was looking at. Well, my father said, holding out a set of keys like he was presenting a medal. Happy almost birthday. My brother made a sound I can only describe as a shriek. He grabbed the keys, he grabbed my father, he ran his hands over the hood like he needed to confirm with his palms that this was real. My mother stood beside me on the porch step, smiling the exact same smile she used for church photos. Practiced, aimed at nothing in particular. I clapped. I said congratulations, and I meant it, because whatever else was true about my family, my brother hadn't asked for any of this, and it wasn't his fault the scales in that house had never once tipped in my direction. He was 14. He didn't understand yet what it cost other people when he got things early. I understood. I'd had 18 years of practice understanding exactly what it cost, because here's the thing that made that day different. It was my birthday, not his, mine. I had turned 18 4 hours earlier, alone in my bedroom, getting dressed for a dinner nobody had actually planned to be about me. We went back inside once the shrieking died down, and my mother lit the candles on the cake that said congratulations to a boy who wasn't the one who'd aged that day. 18 of them. She must have counted them out for my birthday, and then simply not swapped the icing, as if nobody in the room would notice the math didn't hold. I blew them out. All 18. My brother stood next to me at the table, still glowing with truck-adjacent joy, and I made a wish I don't remember because I was too busy holding my face together. Everyone sang. My aunt has a lovely voice, and she carried the whole table through it, and for about 40 seconds I let myself pretend the cake said my name. Then the song ended and the cake got cut, and the first slice, the corner piece with the most icing, went to my brother. I got the piece next to it. Fair, I suppose, in the accounting my family used. Adjacent to the good piece. Close enough to see it, never quite it. After the cake, my father found me at the kitchen sink. I was washing the good serving fork by hand because it wasn't dishwasher safe, and the water was too hot and I didn't adjust it because adjusting it would have meant letting go of the one task I had left that made sense. He put his hand on my shoulder, heavy, the way you'd rest a hand on something you already owned. Now that you're 18, he said, we should talk about what that means. I turned off the water. I already knew, the way you know a storm is coming from the pressure change in a room, that what was coming next was not a birthday gift. It was a policy update. He delivered it in 3 parts because my father had spent 30 years running a hardware counter, and some part of him had never stopped organizing his thoughts like a customer service script. Part 1 was responsibility. Now that I was a legal adult, it was time I started pulling my weight properly around the house. Part 2 was gratitude. Everything I had, this family had given me, and a grateful daughter didn't spend her time wanting things, comparing what she had to what anyone else had. That part came with a look, brief but unmistakable, aimed at the door my brother had just walked through with truck keys in his fist. Part 3 was family. Family doesn't keep score, he said, delivering the line with the same straight face he'd used to hand my brother a truck 4 hours earlier on my birthday, with my name nowhere on the cake. My mother stood in the doorway through all 3 parts, nodding along on the beat like a metronome someone had wound and set going. She never added anything. Her nodding did all the talking that needed doing, and it agreed with him completely, the way it always had. I dried the serving fork, put it away, and said, okay. I had spent 18 years learning that certain doors in that house simply didn't open, no matter how politely or how many times you knocked. And I'd learned it so thoroughly that I didn't even feel the urge to knock anymore. I just filed it. Another entry in a ledger I hadn't decided to keep, but had been keeping anyway. The way you learn a language just by living inside it long enough. That night, once the house had gone quiet, I sat on my bed and looked at my room. The smaller of the 2 upstairs bedrooms, the one with the window that faced the driveway, so that if I turned my head, I could see the truck sitting there in the dark, bow still on it, catching the porch light. I want to tell you that was the moment I decided to leave. It wasn't, not exactly. The decision had been made in smaller pieces over years, the way erosion happens, one grain at a time, until one day you look up and there's a canyon where a hill used to be. What happened that night wasn't a decision. It was just the moment I finally noticed the canyon. To understand why a cake with the wrong name on it was enough to move me, you have to understand what came before it, because the cake wasn't the injury. It was just the last entry on a very long list. I work nights now, in a diner that isn't in the town I grew up in, and I've had 11 years years to think about how to explain my family to people who didn't grow up inside it. The shorthand I've landed on is this. My parents ran a hardware store on Main Street that my grandfather had built, and somewhere along the way, without anyone deciding it out loud, that store's whole philosophy of who mattered and why got imported into how they raised their kids. My brother was always going to run that store. Everyone knew it before he could walk. It wasn't cruelty, exactly, at least not the kind you could point to and name. It was more like a law of nature nobody questioned, the way you don't question which way water runs downhill. My grandfather had a son. My father was that son, and he ran the store after his own father retired, and my brother was simply next in that line, whether or not he'd earned it, whether or not there was a sister standing right there who knew the inventory system better than anyone in the building. I did know it better than anyone in the building. That's not pride talking. It's just a fact I collected the way I collected most facts in that house, quietly, without anyone asking me to. I started working there for free when I was 10. Officially, I was just helping out, the way any kid helps out around a family business, but the help was not evenly distributed. I spent my summers on a step stool in the back room, pricing stock with a sticker gun that left ink on my fingers for days, while my brother, 2 years younger, sat on the front counter eating whatever candy was closest and watching my father work the till like it was the most fascinating educational experience a child could have. I asked once if I could learn the register too. I remember exactly how little my father's attention moved when he answered. He didn't look up from what he was doing. He said I was doing fine where I was. Where I was pricing washers. The chore chart on our refrigerator had one name written across every single line for years. Mine. Dishes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Laundry every Sunday. Inventory at the store every other Saturday, starting when I was 12. My brother's chores, when the chart bothered to acknowledge he had any, were listed as helping dad, which in practice meant riding along to the lumberyard and getting a hot dog on the way home. My mother kept the store's books, unpaid, for something like 30 years, and you would think a woman doing 30 years of unpaid bookkeeping might notice the particular arithmetic of her own household. Instead, she enforced it. Your brother needs quiet to concentrate on his homework. Take the smaller room. Your brother needs space for his weights. Hand me the dish towel. You're closer. Nobody hit me. I want to be precise about that, because when people hear a story like mine, they sometimes brace for something more dramatic than what actually happened. What happened in that house was quieter than that. It took me most of a decade to find language for it, and the language I eventually found was this. I was raised as staff who happened to share a last name with the family she worked for. There's a specific afternoon I still think about from when I was maybe 12. A customer at the store, an older man buying a box of nails, asked my father in that easy small talk way strangers ask things whether his kids would take over the place someday. My father clapped my brother on the shoulder, beaming, and said his boy was going to run the place. Then he glanced at me, at the mop I was holding because I'd been sent to deal with a spill in aisle 3, and added, almost as an afterthought, that the girl was good help. The customer laughed. My father laughed. I kept mopping because the alternative was standing there and letting everyone see that I'd heard exactly what had just been said about me in front of a stranger in the store I knew better than either of the men laughing about it. Good help. Not a daughter running the family business someday. Help. By the time I was in my senior year of high school, I had found the one thing in my life that felt entirely like mine, untouched by any of it. My school arranged a field trip to the regional hospital, and I ended up shadowing a nurse for an afternoon. She let me watch her start an IV on a mannequin arm, walked me through the process slow enough that I actually understood it, and something in me clicked into place that I still can't fully explain, except to say it felt like finding out there was a version of competence in the world that had nothing to do with pleasing anyone. I came home that day glowing, and at dinner I said the word nursing out loud for the first time. Brochure folded in my back pocket, prerequisites first, then the actual program, and I'd done the math already on notebook paper. Waitressing could cover about half of it if my parents helped with the rest. My father let me finish. Then he wiped his mouth with his napkin and delivered the sentence I could recite in my sleep to this day. Money doesn't grow on trees. This family doesn't hand out free rides. My brother at the time was 16 and had never worked a single shift anywhere in his life. I want to plant something here because it becomes important later, and because I didn't understand its importance at the time either. That same spring, not long after the nursing conversation, I came home from school and found my parents at the kitchen table with a man I didn't recognize. All three of them bent over some paperwork, smiling in the specific way people smile when they think they've found a good deal. When I walked in, my mother closed the folder fast, the way you'd shut a drawer if someone caught you reaching for something that wasn't yours. She said it was store business. I believed her, because there wasn't yet a reason not to. And there was an envelope. I want to describe this one carefully, because I've replayed it in my head more times than almost any other memory I have. It arrived addressed to me, my full name printed clean across the front, from a bank in the city I'd never once set foot in. I was 17. I stood in the kitchen turning it over in my hands, genuinely confused, because what business would a bank I'd never heard of have with a girl who'd never had so much as a checking account? I asked my mother what it was. She took it from my hands the way you'd take a knife from a toddler, quick and practiced. Junk mail, honey, she said. They send those to everybody. And then she tucked it into the pocket of her apron and started talking about something else entirely. And I let it go, because I was 17 and I had no framework yet for understanding that a mother taking mail out of her daughter's hands and changing the subject was itself a kind of answer. I noticed. I asked. I got a response engineered specifically to end the conversation before it could become one. I didn't think about that envelope again for a long time. I want you to remember it anyway, because I did, eventually. And when I finally understood what it meant, event, it rearranged everything else I thought I knew about that house. People imagine leavings like mine happen in an explosion. A door slammed hard enough to rattle a picture frame, a suitcase thrown together in a fury, a scene with volume and witnesses. Mine happened over a kitchen sink in yellow rubber gloves, with my mother's good serving fork drying in the rack, and nobody in the house even knew it was happening until it already had. After my father's 3-part speech, after the cake got wrapped in plastic and set in the refrigerator, after my brother had been permitted to fall asleep with the keys still in his hand, I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time without turning on the light. I wasn't crying. I expected to, that some part of me had been braced for it all evening, holding my face together at the table the way you hold your breath underwater. But what came instead of tears was something quieter, something that felt less like grief and more like arithmetic finally resolving. I thought about the shoebox in my closet before I thought about anything else, which tells you something about which part of me was actually in charge that night. I'd been putting money into that shoebox for 2 years without letting myself think too hard about why. Birthday cash from relatives who at least remembered the date, if not always the person. Stray $5 bills from babysitting the neighbor's kids. A 10 here, a 20 there. Money I never spent, because spending it would have required admitting to myself what I was saving it for. Some part of me had known for a long time that I was building an exit. The rest of me had been very carefully not looking at what that part was doing. I counted it that night by the light of my phone, sitting cross-legged on the floor of my closet so the light wouldn't show under the door. $60. Not much by any reasonable measure. Enough for a bus ticket and maybe 3 days of food if I was careful. It felt, at the time, like an enormous sum because it was the only money in my entire life that had never once been contingent on anyone else's approval. I didn't pack much. A gray hoodie, because the night was cool. A change of clothes, folded small enough to fit in my school backpack alongside the folder of documents I'd need, my birth certificate, my social security card, my diploma, all of which I knew the location of, because I was the one who'd always been sent to fetch them whenever the family needed some piece of paperwork located. It's a strange thing to realize, packing to leave a house, that you're the only person in it who knows where anything actually is. I stood in my doorway a moment before I left the room for the last time as my room. It had never really been mine beyond geography. It was the smaller bedroom because my brother needed space for his weights. It had the water stain in the corner of the ceiling that had been there since I was 9 and never gotten fixed, the way things that were only my problem tended not to get fixed. I looked at it for maybe 10 seconds, then turned and went down the stairs. I didn't leave a note. A note is for people who are going to wonder where you went, and I had 18 years of data telling me that wasn't going to happen. I knew, with a certainty that still unsettles me a little, that the chores were the only thing in that house reliably attached to my presence, and my parents would notice my absence only once something needed doing that I usually did. I was right, as it turned out, though I didn't find that out until much later. It took them most of 2 full days to realize I was actually gone, because the theory that held for that long was simply that I was sulking upstairs, and the chore chart absorbed the difference quietly enough that nobody thought to check. At 4 in the morning, I walked out through the kitchen door, the same door my father had walked my brother out of 8 hours earlier to reveal a truck with a bow on it. I passed that truck on my way down the driveway, ribbons still drooping off the hood, dew beating on the silver paint in the pre-dawn cold, and I didn't stop to look at it. I just walked past it, down to the end of the driveway, and turned onto the road that led to the gas station a mile and a half away, the one place in town where the Greyhound stopped. The walk took about 25 minutes. I remember it in more detail than almost anything else from that period of my life, probably because it was the last stretch of time in which I was still, technically, the version of myself that had grown up in that house. Every step past that point was a step into whatever came next, and I didn't yet know what that was. I just knew it had to be something other than what I was walking away from. The gas station had a single fluorescent light buzzing over the pumps, and a clerk inside who didn't look up when I checked the bus schedule taped inside a plastic sleeve on the wall. The first bus out was scheduled for 6:40, which meant a little over 2 hours waiting in the cold, sitting on the curb with my backpack between my feet, watching the sky turn from black to gray to something that wasn't quite morning yet. I bought the ticket with cash, $28, which left me $32 and change and no plan beyond the word city. I didn't look out the window as the bus pulled away from the only town I'd ever lived in. I looked straight ahead at the seat back in front of me and thought about nothing at all, which I've come to understand is its own kind of coping, the mind refusing to process more than it can survive processing in one sitting. The bus ride took just under 2 hours. I spent it doing math in my head, the same math over and over. $32, how many meals, how many nights, and getting the same unsatisfying answer every time, which was not many, not nearly enough, and I was going to have to figure something out fast, or I was going to be in real trouble within a matter of days. I did not yet know that figuring it out fast was something I was, against all evidence available to me at 18, actually capable of doing. The city, when the bus finally deposited me at its downtown terminal a little before 9 that morning, was loud in a way that felt almost merciful. Nobody there knew my name. Nobody there had an opinion about whether I deserved a truck or a lecture. It was just noise and movement and 1,000 strangers who had never once weighed me against my brother and found me the lighter of the two. I spent the first night in that terminal, sitting against a wall with my backpack strap wrapped twice around my wrist so I'd feel it if anyone tried to take it while I dozed. It was frightening, and the terminal smelled like industrial bleach layered over something less clean, and I did not sleep so much as drift in and out of a watchful half-consciousness, but I would do that night again, without hesitation, before I'd go back to the house I'd left, not certain of what came next, certain of what I wasn't going back to. to. In the morning, stiff and hollow-eyed, I found a woman at an information desk and asked whether she knew of anywhere a person could go if they needed somewhere to stay. She gave me the look adults give teenagers who are clearly not where they're supposed to be, then slid a printed flyer across the counter. A drop-in center a few blocks over, the kind of place that exists for people who show up exactly the way I had. The drop-in center led me to a youth shelter that took in 18 to 21-year-olds, a bunk, a locker with a combination lock, and a caseworker who spoke like a drill sergeant and kept butterscotch candies in her desk drawer for reasons she never explained. She was the first adult in longer than I could remember who asked direct questions and actually waited for direct answers, rather than already knowing before I opened my mouth exactly what she wanted the answer to be. On my third day there, I used the payphone in the hallway, the only number I'd carried with me on a scrap of paper folded into my wallet, and called my grandmother. She matters more to this story than almost anyone else in it. My father's mother, a woman everyone in town called by her first name preceded by a term of endearment, the way small towns do with women who've outlived most of their generation. She was the only person in that entire extended family who had ever said my name like it meant something specific, like I wasn't interchangeable with any other quiet, useful daughter who might have been raised in that house instead of me. She picked up on the second ring, which I've since learned wasn't luck. She told me much later that she'd been sitting by that phone on and off for 2 days because she'd heard from my mother that I hadn't come down for breakfast, and she'd known, the way she seemed to know most things about that family before anyone said them out loud, exactly what had happened. I'm safe, I told her. I'm in the city. Please don't tell them where. I could hear her breathing on the other end, steady, unhurried, the way you'd listen to a clock in a quiet room. I won't, she said. And then, before she hung up, she added the sentence I've carried with me every single day since, folded up somewhere in the back of my mind the way I'd folded that scrap of paper with her number on it. For the record, child, she said, you should have had your own cake. It sounds small, written down like that. Stand where I was standing, though, 20 cents poorer for the call, in a hallway that smelled like industrial floor cleaner, having just spent 3 days learning what it felt like to belong to absolutely no one. It was the first time in 18 years that anyone had put what happened to me on the record at all, stated plainly, without hedging, without finding some more comfortable frame to put around it. You should have had your own cake. I have never needed anyone to say more than that to me about what my childhood was. That sentence contained the whole of it. By the end of that first week, I had found work, a diner a few blocks from the shelter, with a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years and an owner built like a mailbox and pushing 60, who hired me because I showed up at 6 in the morning 2 days running without being asked to. He started me in the dish pit, which suited me fine, because after a childhood proving my usefulness through invisible labor, scrubbing plates in near silence felt less like a hardship and more like familiar ground. Within a month, my boss had moved me up to waitressing the counter, and I discovered something that surprised me. I was good at it, genuinely, unmistakably good, in a way nothing at home had ever let me be good at anything visible. It took me a while to understand why, and when I finally did, the realization stung a little. I was good at it because I'd spent my entire childhood being trained to read a room, anticipate what was needed before it was asked for, and stay quiet and useful while doing it. Waitressing, it turned out, was just that skill set with better tips. The other weekend waitress was a woman a couple years older than me, loud in the way that felt like sunlight after a childhood around people who communicated mostly through silence. She was working toward her GED on her breaks, and when she found out where I'd been sleeping, she said her cousin had a spare room, split rent, and asked one question. Was I going to be weird about doing my share of the dishes in the shared sink? I told her no. She said good, and that was that. She became the first friend I ever chose for myself rather than inherited by circumstance. Every Sunday, my grandmother called at 4, and we traded our weeks like currency. Her hip, which bothered her more in the cold, my tips. The pie situation at her church, reported with the seriousness of a formal complaint or occasionally a commendation. She never once asked when I was coming home. Instead, she asked better questions. What a catheter actually was once I'd started nursing school. Whether my boss paid overtime. Small, real questions, the kind that told me she was actually listening rather than waiting to redirect the conversation. I noticed something else too, something I filed away the way I filed most things. After that first tearful phone call from my father, the one where he'd begged me to come home, he never called again. Not on my next birthday, not at Christmas. A man who had wept down a phone line, who had sounded like his chest was caving in, simply went silent and stayed silent. Longer than grief of that apparent size should have lasted if it had actually been grief for me and not for something else entirely. It would be years before I understood exactly what that something else was. But even that early, sitting in my roommate's cousin's apartment with $60 long since spent and a diner job keeping me fed, some quiet, unsentimental part of me had already started keeping notes. 2 weeks after my birthday, almost to the day, I was standing behind the counter at the diner, refilling ketchup bottles before the breakfast rush hit, when my phone buzzed in the front pocket of my apron. I'd gotten a cheap prepaid phone by then, mostly so my grandmother could reach me on Sundays without relying on a shelter payphone, and I hadn't given the number to anyone else, which is why my stomach dropped a little when I saw the screen. Dad. I stood there a second, ketchup bottle in hand, and my boss, working the grill nearby, glanced over and said, "Take it or don't, but the coffee's about to burn." I took it. My father was crying. In 18 years under his roof, I had never once heard the man cry. Not at his own father's funeral, where I watched him hold his composure like it was load-bearing. Not during the worst arguments he and my mother ever had, late enough that they thought I was asleep. He simply didn't do it, and hearing him fall apart down a phone line was disorienting enough to briefly override every other instinct I had. He said my name name, and it came apart in his mouth the way a word does when someone can barely get it out. Oh, please, just come home. Your mother's sick over this. I know we did wrong by you. 18 years, and I could count on one hand the times either of my parents had used a word like sweetheart with me, meaning it. And here it was pouring out of him. Please, sweetheart, come home. We were wrong. And some old, tired, 8-year-old part of me that had spent a childhood at the top of the stairs hoping to be called down was already packing a bag in my head. My eyes went hot. I heard myself start to say, okay. And then, underneath his crying, so quiet I almost missed it, I heard my mother's voice in the background, not crying, not even particularly urgent, just low and fast and businesslike, the exact tone she used at the store when a customer was taking too long, deciding between two brands of the same tool. She didn't know the phone would carry her voice that clearly. Just get her home first, she said. The paperwork can wait till she's here. The paperwork can wait till she's here. I stood there holding the phone, my father still crying, still saying my name, and I listened to both channels of that call at once. The grief on top and something colder and more procedural underneath, and something in me went very still. You still there, baby? He said again. I looked at the ketchup bottle in my other hand the way you'd look at something moving at the edge of your vision. I hung up. I don't remember deciding to so much as noticing, a few seconds later, that I had. I wiped my hands on my apron and refilled 4 cups of coffee in a row without spilling a drop, which I mention only because it tells you how far outside my own body I felt, capable of precise competence, while something enormous rearranged itself underneath. That night, my grandmother texted me a single line, the first text message I'd ever gotten from a woman who generally preferred the phone. Don't come back for them, it read. If you ever come back for you. I gave myself exactly 1 night to fall apart, and then I was done, the way you're done with a shift, on schedule. I sat on the fire escape with a gas station iced tea and cried until the streetlights blurred, and when I was finished, I went back inside and slept. And in the morning, I woke up with a plan starting to take shape, though I didn't yet understand what it was a plan for. Because here is the thing I want to be honest about. I didn't know, that night, what the paperwork actually was. I had a fragment, a phrase overheard under my father's crying, delivered in my mother's brisk, get-it-done voice. Paperwork that could wait until I was physically present. Something involving me, specifically, something that needed my body in that house rather than just my voice on a phone. That was all I had. It was enough to stop me from going home. It was not yet enough to tell me exactly what I'd almost walked back into. That gap matters for everything that comes after. I knew something was wrong. I did not yet know what. There's a particular dread that lives in the space between knowing you've been handled and understanding exactly how, and I lived in it longer than I would have liked, because chasing down an answer costs money and time and institutional patience that an 18-year-old diner waitress sleeping on a borrowed couch didn't have yet. So I flipped over a napkin one slow afternoon and wrote out a plan in a borrowed ballpoint pen, because a plan was the one thing nobody could take out of my hands, the way my mother once took an envelope. Cheapest entry into a nursing program. Prerequisites first, 1 class a semester, paid in cash because a financial aid form would need my parents' signatures, and I already understood that was never going to be freely given again. Then the program, then my license. I gave myself 7 years and taped that napkin inside my locker, and later inside every apartment cabinet I've had since, because some part of me understood the plan itself was the only inheritance I'd ever get from that house. What I didn't know yet, sitting at that counter with a napkin and a borrowed pen, was that the answer to what the paperwork actually was had been sitting in my own name for 2 years already, quietly accumulating interest, waiting for the day I turned 18 and became old enough to be legally responsible for it. It took me nearly 3 years to get the full picture. Not because I wasn't looking, but because looking cost things I didn't have yet. Money for the right kind of help. Standing in the eyes of institutions that don't take a runaway 18-year-old diner waitress especially seriously when she calls asking questions about her own financial history. Time, which I spent instead on prerequisites and shifts, and the slow, unglamorous work of building a life from a shoebox of birthday cash. I want to walk through exactly how it finally came together, because the order matters. It didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces, the way a puzzle does, one edge at a time, until the shape of the whole thing became impossible not to see. The first piece came when I was 20, trying to lease an apartment with my roommate, the two of us finally ready to graduate from her cousin's spare room to a real place of our own with a dishwasher and a tree outside the window. We filled out the application together at the leasing office, and the property manager ran our credit while we waited, and I watched his expression change in a way I still remember precisely, a kind of careful stillness settling over his face as he read something on his screen that he clearly hadn't expected to find attached to a 20-year-old applicant. He asked my roommate to give us a minute. Then he turned the monitor a few degrees toward me, not all the way people angle a screen when the news is bad but not technically theirs to deliver, and told me there was a credit issue. Accounts going back years, he said. Collections activity. Charge-offs. He looked at me, then back at the screen, and said the sentence that split my life into a clean before and after. You've got a whole adult's credit history here. You said you're 20. I want you to understand how impossible that sounded to me in the moment. I had never had a credit card, never taken out a loan. I paid for everything in cash, a habit I'd built out of necessity that I'd always quietly thought of as a virtue, proof that I'd built my adult life clean, without debt, without dependence on anyone. Standing at that counter, I felt something cold work its way up through my chest as the property manager kept talking, and I understood before I'd even seen the actual report that whatever was on it was not going to have a simple explanation. I pulled my credit report that same night, sitting cross-legged on my roommate's floor floor with my laptop balanced on my knees. All 3 bureaus, the free versions everyone's entitled to once a year. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. The way your hands go steady before something you already know is going to be bad. Some older, calmer part of you taking over because the rest of you isn't equipped to handle it yet. 4 accounts, 2 credit cards, a store card, and a personal line of credit. All at a bank on Main Street back home. The same bank whose lollipops I remembered from childhood visits with my mother. The same bank my father had specifically wanted to take me to the Monday after my 18th birthday, back when I'd still assumed that visit was going to be about opening my first proper adult account. Combined, with interest and late fees layered on top of the original balances, the total came to just over $23,000. I want to give you the exact number, because the exact number matters more than any description I could offer of how it felt to see it. $23,400. The oldest of the 4 accounts had been opened in October, when I was 16 years old. I sat on that floor doing the arithmetic of my own childhood, working backward through years I'd lived through without any idea that a stranger somewhere in a bank's back office had been quietly building a financial history in my name the entire time. I thought about every lecture my father had ever delivered to me about money not growing on trees, about this family not handing out free rides, delivered across a kitchen table while my own name was out there, at that very moment, working for him at whatever punishing interest rate that account carried. This family doesn't hand out free rides, he'd told me. He was right. It hadn't been a ride. It had been a loan, and I was the one making the payments. Except I hadn't known I was making any payments at all, because nobody had ever told me the debt existed. And then the last key slid into place so quietly, I actually heard myself exhale when it did. I remembered the folder, the one my parents had snapped shut on the kitchen table the day I came home from school and found them sitting with a man I didn't recognize. All 3 of them bent over paperwork, smiling the way people smile over a good deal. I remembered the envelope from the bank I'd never heard of, addressed to me at 17, the one my mother had taken out of my hands and called junk mail before I could ask a second question. I remembered my father's Monday morning plan, delivered so casually at the edge of my own birthday party. Now that you're 18, there's grown-up paperwork to square away. Bank stuff. I called the fraud department at that same bank on my lunch break the next day, sitting in my car in the diner parking lot with a legal pad balanced on the steering wheel, because by then, I had already learned to take notes on everything, a habit that would only get more thorough as the years went on. The woman who answered had the particular voice of someone who has heard every version of this story there is to hear, and didn't sound surprised by mine. I explained. Accounts opened in my name while I was still a minor, at a bank I had never once walked into as an actual customer. She asked one question before anything else. Would my parent or guardian have had access to my social security number growing up? I said yes, of course. They were my parents. She said that the date of birth listed on an application isn't always cross-checked carefully against the applicant standing in front of the teller, that lenders in a small-town branch, especially one that had known a family for generations, tend to extend a certain baseline trust that larger institutions wouldn't. To formally dispute it as fraud, she told me, I would need to file a police report and complete a federal identity theft affidavit. And on that affidavit, she said, her voice softening slightly in a way that told me she'd delivered this particular piece of information many times before to many people in situations like mine. There's a line where you name the person who used your identity, and you sign beneath it under penalty of perjury. Most people your age in this situation never actually file, she told me. I asked her why, though some part of me already suspected the answer before she gave it. Because, honey, she said, in cases like yours, the name that goes on that line is usually a parent. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after we hung up, engine off, watching heat come up off the asphalt in visible waves, turning the whole thing over. $23,400, opened when I was 16, discovered when I was 20, and a line on a federal form that was going to ask me to choose, formally, permanently, between my own financial future and my father's name. I already knew, sitting there, which one I was going to choose. I'd known it, in some sense, since the moment I heard my mother's voice under my father's crying, telling him the paperwork could wait until I was home. I just hadn't yet had the actual number to attach to that knowledge. Now I did. $23,400, 4 accounts, one name on the line where the fraud started, and it wasn't mine. I filed the police report on a Tuesday morning in the rain, sitting across a metal desk from a detective who read through everything I'd brought without once looking surprised. When he got to the line on the affidavit, the one where you name the person who used your identity, he slid it across to me without a word and just watched while I picked up the pen. My hand was steadier than I expected, steadier, if I'm honest, than it has ever been signing anything since. I called my father that same afternoon, once the report had a case number attached to it, because I wanted him to hear it from me before he heard it from anyone else. He didn't ask what accounts. He didn't ask what I was talking about. He simply said, in the same even voice he'd used to hand my brother a set of truck keys years earlier, that family money was family money, and that I'd have wasted it on myself anyway. I asked him if he understood what he'd actually done. Opened the first account when I was 16, let it run for 2 years before I was even old enough to be legally chased for it. Waited until the exact morning I turned 18 to start asking for my signature on the rest, so the debt could finally, properly become mine, instead of a crime that could still be pinned on him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the only thing he had left to say, the sentence I still hear sometimes, late at night, when the diner's quiet and the coffee's gone cold in the pot, you'll always be my daughter. That doesn't change because of some paperwork. I told him the paperwork was the only thing in that house that had ever told the truth about what I was to him. Then I hung up, and I have not spoken to him since.